Some Roman emperors are remembered for their victories, for the lands they conquered, or for the grand monuments they left behind. Others are cursed for rivers of blood, for cruelty that echoed through centuries. But then, there is one name that refuses to fit either tale. When people whisper about him, they don't speak of battles won, nor of laws decreed, nor of roads or bridges built. They simply say, he was the emperor who married a nun, who draped himself in silken gowns, who offered the Roman Empire to a black stone from the Syrian desert, and who, perhaps, was the first in history to long to become a woman. That name is Elagabalus, a boy of just 14 plucked from distant Syria, suddenly placed upon the throne of the greatest empire in the world. A teenage high priest of the sun god, transformed overnight into the ruler of Rome, the city believed to stand under the sacred protection of Jupiter himself. And from that moment, Rome witnessed what it had never seen before: frenzied rituals, sexual chaos, and an open defiance of tradition, religion, and the very idea of Roman masculinity. You might think Roman history is already overflowing with tyrants, but Elagabalus was something different. He didn't massacre thousands like Nero, nor turn the arena into a bloodbath like Commodus. What enraged Rome was not rivers of blood, but difference. A difference so strange, so unapologetically raw, that nearly 2,000 years later, his name still unsettles us. So who was Elagabalus, really? A mad emperor, or a lost child swallowed by power and desire? A decadent villain? Or perhaps the faint, early echo of ideas about gender identity and personal freedom? In this video, we step into one of the strangest tales of ancient Rome, the story of the emperor who turned the throne into a stage and his very body into a rebellion against an entire civilization. Born in the year 204 AD in the city of Emesa, modern-day Homs in Syria, Elagabalus was hardly the kind of child anyone would have imagined sitting on the Roman throne. Emesa was no center of imperial power, no glittering Rome, but an eastern city where temples of the sun god rose above the desert. There, long processions marched through the streets, drums and trumpets echoing, and among the priests in their dazzling robes stood a boy learning to dance, to sing, and to serve the deity known as Elagabal, the Syrian sun god. His birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus. Strange, isn't it? Nothing in that name evoked empire, Caesar, or conquest. And yet his bloodline told a different story. Elagabalus was the grandson of Julia Maesa, a formidable matriarch of the Severan dynasty, a family that had already ruled Rome. It was this blood, and the ruthless ambition of his grandmother, that transformed a temple boy into one of the most infamous symbols of Rome's decline. The tale begins with Caracalla, a Roman emperor both tyrannical and brutal. In 217, Caracalla was assassinated, and the throne fell into the hands of an outsider, Macrinus, a mere praetorian official. The empire trembled. Julia Maesa, living in exile in Syria, saw her chance. She knew the Roman legions, long loyal to the Severans, would never warm to an outsider like Macrinus. But if she could put someone of Severan blood back on the throne, Rome would once again fall under her family's grasp. That was when her gaze fixed upon her 14-year-old grandson, Elagabalus, a boy with sun-browned skin, dark eyes, and no knowledge of war, only incense, chants, and ritual. Yet Maesa knew how to turn weakness into strength. There was one rumor she could exploit, that the boy's supposed father had once been romantically linked, perhaps even blood-linked, to Caracalla. And so Maesa spread the tale far and wide. Elagabalus, she declared, was the secret son of the slain emperor. To the soldiers, those words were a spark in a field of dry straw. They had fought under Caracalla, they had sworn loyalty to the Severan line, and now, before them, stood a legitimate heir. A boy with an Eastern face, but with the blood of the emperor they once vowed never to betray. So, under the blazing Syrian sun, in the heart of the camp, a ritual was performed. Elagabalus was draped in imperial robes, hoisted upon the shoulders of soldiers, and hailed as if Caesar himself had returned. He did not ascend the throne through conquest, nor through the Senate's consent. He rose by deception, by a fabricated bloodline, and by the cunning of a grandmother who played the empire like a game of dice. Picture that moment. A 14-year-old boy who had never set foot in Rome, who had never commanded a legion, suddenly proclaimed emperor over millions stretching from Britain to Egypt. Chronicles suggest that in that very moment, Elagabalus himself scarcely understood what was happening. He had been a priest, And now he was Augustus, Imperator, Pontifex Maximus. History is filled with men who seized the throne through bloodshed, others through intricate plots. Elagabalus, however, was crowned before he could even grasp the weight of power. And it was precisely for that reason that the years to follow would unfold as a tragedy, the tragedy of a boy turned emperor whose heart remained bound to the sun god of the Syrian desert rather than to Rome. In the year 218 AD, at just 14 years old, Elagabalus made his formal entrance into Rome. Picture the scene. A Syrian boy, raised under the desert sun and steeped in the rituals of the sun god, stepping into the capital of the world. Towering white walls, colossal monuments, and the cold, calculating gaze of the Senate all bore down on him. Rome had seen young emperors before, but never one so foreign, so alien to its traditions. Elagabalus was lifted onto the throne, but the truth was that he held no real power. The empire was run by Julia Maesa, his formidable grandmother, and his mother, Julia Soaemias. From behind the curtains of the imperial palace, they issued decrees, distributed rewards, and handed down punishments. The boy emperor, meanwhile, seemed more interested in rituals, costumes, and entertainments. To put it bluntly, Elagabalus was a gilded puppet on the throne, with two ambitious women pulling the strings. This infuriated the Roman elite. Many were already uneasy that the purple had passed into the hands of an Eastern teenager, and now they watched with disdain as Syrian women controlled the empire. For proud Rome, long accustomed to emperors forged on the battlefield, this was nothing less than an insult. Elagabalus, however, appeared unbothered. He made no effort to play the stern general or the serious statesman. Instead, he embraced the role of emperor as though it were simply an extension of his priesthood. Only now, his stage was all of Rome. Senate meetings could never compete with the lure of festivals, banquets, and sacred performances. To Rome's conservatives, this was bitter disappointment. They had hoped for a young emperor who might restore the empire after years of turmoil, a warrior who would ride into battle and carve new victories into history. What they saw instead was a teenager in makeup, draped in silk, entranced by Eastern rituals. An emperor who did not act like an emperor at all, but more like a performer, an outsider who neither understood Rome nor cared to. And yet, one cannot ignore the fact that Elagabalus was at heart only a child thrown into a game far larger than himself. He had not chosen the throne had chosen him. And with the eyes of an empire fixed upon him, he responded simply as himself, curious, eager, and utterly indifferent to the gravity Rome demanded. Those first months on the throne sowed the seeds of discord. The army began to doubt, the Senate grew contemptuous, and whispers spread among the people of their strange new emperor. Rome had never seen a ruler like this. And this was only the beginning. For soon after, Elagabalus would commit an act that sent shockwaves through the empire. He brought his desert god into the very heart of Rome, elevating him to stand alongside and even above Jupiter, the supreme deity of the Romans. And from that moment, the true tragedy began. The moment he set foot in Rome, Elagabalus wasted no time in bringing what he considered his most sacred treasure, the god Elagabal. Not Jupiter, not Mars, not the deities Rome had honored for centuries. Instead, he carried with him a foreign god from the deserts of Syria, worshipped not in human form, but as a gleaming black stone, a meteorite fallen from the heavens. For the Romans, Jupiter stood as the pinnacle of divine authority, the protector of the city, the very reason Rome had risen to become the center of the world. Yet Elagabalus did something unthinkable. He brought the holy stone of Emesa into Rome, raised a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, a place that tradition reserved for Jupiter. And with the conviction of a boy who truly believed he was right, he set Elagabal above all other gods, even above Jupiter himself. Imagine the shock of the Senate and the Roman people. A teenager from the East, who neither understood nor cared to understand the sacred traditions of centuries, boldly placed a foreign god not just beside, but above Jupiter. It was as if he were declaring that Rome had been wrong for generations, that its gods were nothing, and that true divinity now lay in the hands of a foreign youth with a stone from the desert. But Elagabalus did more than build a temple. He forced the people and the Senate to attend strange new rituals. The sacrifices were enormous in scale. Blood from slaughtered animals flowed in streams, bones and flesh piled high before the idol. Chroniclers claim that Elagabalus himself would stand at the center of the ceremony, dressed in shimmering robes, dancing the frenzied steps of a priest while hot blood steamed at his feet. Whispers spread through the city. Some said that animals were not his only offerings. There were rumors of human sacrifices, of children and strong young men killed in honor of the stone. Roman historians, who despised him, wrote that his rites were a horror meant to disgust the empire itself. Whether those stories were true or merely slanders, history forever tied his name to blood-soaked sacrifice. To the Roman eye, these rituals had nothing of the dignity their faith demanded. They were not the solemn processions of Jupiter, nor the joyful celebrations of Saturnalia. They were alien rites, loud, bloody, and strange. Rome had long tolerated foreign gods, but when an emperor placed his own god above Jupiter, that was no longer religion. It was an insult. In the eyes of the Romans, Elagabalus became more than just a heretical ruler. He was the man who dared to tamper with the very foundations of Rome's sacred order, who forced the proudest city on earth to bow before a stone from Syria's sands. From that moment on, he was no longer merely the foreign boy emperor. He had become a threat to the very soul of Rome itself. If the blood-soaked rites with meteorite stones had already left Rome in shock, Elagabalus went even further, staging performances that bewildered the empire. He turned religion into a kind of grand theater where the solemn dignity of Roman ritual was upended and remade into something wild, almost grotesque. His processions looked nothing like the sacred ceremonies Romans had known for centuries. Draped in purple robes, he rode a gilded chariot that crept slowly through the streets. But instead of sitting in imperial splendor, he reversed the roles, forcing himself to walk backward, pulling the chariot of the god Elagabalus like a slave. Behind him, attendants scattered rose petals, poured wine, and sang in frenzied ecstasy, while the crowd stared at one another in confusion. Was this religion or mockery? And then there was the dancing. Chroniclers whisper that Elagabalus, emperor of Rome, danced before the idol of his god nearly naked, his skin gleaming with gold dust, swaying to the beat of Eastern drums and pipes. To him, it was sacred worship. To the Roman people, it was public humiliation. Never before had an emperor debased himself so openly. Never before had an Augustus transformed into a dancer before an altar. But the final outrage came with a choice that no Roman could forgive. Elagabalus married a Vestal Virgin. These priestesses, bound to eternal chastity, were guardians of the eternal flame of Rome itself. To touch a Vestal was a grave sacrilege, but to marry one was to spit directly in the face of the gods. Whispers spread through the city that the emperor had blasphemed against Jupiter, against Vesta, against the very foundations of Roman religion. Alongside the whispers came new names: the foreign boy, the madman in a dress, the destroyer of Rome's gods. Perhaps, in Elagabalus's own mind, it was devotion, an attempt to bind Rome to the greatness of his Syrian sun god. But in the eyes of Rome, it was the seed of betrayal. An emperor not merely breaking with tradition, but using his throne to force his private cult upon the empire. And so, from the Senate to the soldiers, from commoners to the priesthood, one dangerous thought began to take root. This emperor does not belong to Rome. There is something about Roman history that never fails to astonish us. The younger the emperor, the quicker he seemed to be swallowed by desire. Elagabalus didn't just continue that tradition. He turned it into a spectacle, as though the entire empire were nothing more than a stage for his personal indulgence. At only 17, he already had a marriage record most Roman men could scarcely dream of in a lifetime. Ancient sources claim he married at least 5 women in the short span of his reign. Whether all those weddings actually happened or were simply venomous rumors remains uncertain. But one thing is clear. For Elagabalus, marriage was nothing but a game. Among his wives, the most infamous was Aquilia Severa, a consecrated virgin of the goddess Vesta. For the Romans, such a union was not only scandalous, it was sacrilege. Vestal virgins were sworn to chastity for life, their purity believed to safeguard the very security of Rome. To touch them was to violate the city's most sacred trust. And yet, Elagabalus made that ultimate taboo his personal amusement. But his taste for lovers extended far beyond formal marriages. Scattered accounts tell us that he once openly referred to a charioteer slave named Hierocles as his husband. He didn't conceal it. He flaunted it, right before the eyes of the court. Same-sex relationships were not unheard of in Roman culture, but for an emperor to call a slave his husband, that shattered every foundation of Rome's social order. The empire ran on rigid hierarchies, master and servant, free and enslaved, man and woman. Elagabalus broke them all with a single relationship. The marriages and lovers, however, were only the surface. Behind them lay tales far more shocking, the infamous feasts of excess that cemented his reputation for centuries. Historians like Cassius Dio and the compilers of the Historia Augusta describe banquets that stretched on for days, where wine flowed like rivers, food piled into mountains, and guests were coerced into games of indulgence. One story became legendary. Elagabalus is said to have arranged a banquet on the palace rooftop, then ordered showers of rose petals to fall from above. At first, it sounds almost poetic, dining beneath a rain of flowers. But hostile chroniclers twist the tale, claiming the petals came down in such overwhelming quantity that some guests suffocated beneath them. Was it true? Or a grotesque exaggeration meant to brand him as a monster of cruelty and excess? We can't be certain. But whether truth or rumor, the image endures. A young emperor treating human life as nothing more than disposable props for his pleasures. What scandalized the Roman elite even more was how Elagabalus elevated pleasure itself into a kind of religion. Just as he built temples and rites for his god Elagabal, so too did he ritualize desire, worshipping it, sanctifying it, turning lust into something almost divine. Accounts describe him as a restless pilgrim of sensation, forever searching for new experiences. He cycled through lovers with dizzying speed, invented bizarre games of flesh, even cast himself in the role of a slave at feasts to taste the experience of submission. For most Romans, sexuality was simply part of life, but it was bound by laws, customs, and limits. There were lines one did not cross. Elagabalus trampled them all. To him, rules were barriers to be crushed, and pleasure the only truth worth pursuing. No wonder Roman historians, writing from the perspective of a conservative elite, condemned him as nothing less than a beast of lust wearing human skin. And yet, if we strip away the venom of those accusations, another portrait emerges. Elagabalus was not merely a libertine. He was someone who dared to live openly what Roman society worked tirelessly to repress. Imagine a teenage emperor in the heart of imperial Rome, declaring a slave his husband, marrying a Vestal Virgin, transforming desire into ritual. Mad? Perhaps. Cruel? Possibly. But never a hypocrite. That, in the end, is why his story grips us so fiercely. Amid the chaos of marriages, feasts, and whispered scandals, we glimpse a Rome far more complex than the austere image carved by official historians. A Rome where the line between sacred and profane, between love and humiliation, between life and death, could dissolve in the span of a single banquet. And in that world, Elagabalus was not just a debauched ruler. He was the high priest of a strange new faith, a religion of pleasure so audacious, so unthinkable, that only he was reckless enough to invent it. There is a detail in history that leaves readers baffled, astonished, and sometimes even laughing at its sheer audacity. In the middle of the 3rd century, when Rome still saw itself as the very center of order, of law, of virilitas, that sacred notion of true manhood, the young emperor draped himself in sheer silk gowns, painted his lips, lined his eyes, and demanded to be addressed not as emperor, but as empress. They say that Elagabalus didn't just indulge in female attire at private banquets. Even when receiving ambassadors, he would appear with elaborate makeup, intricately braided hair, Asian pearls coiled around his neck, like some Eastern goddess wearing Rome's crown. For Roman society, where the very idea of masculinity was tied to military power, political authority, and ancestral gravity, such a performance was nothing short of a slap in the face. One can hardly imagine the senators sitting in the curia, old men in their white togas, silver hair glinting under the lamplight, throats straining as they shouted about Republican liberty. Forced to bow before a teenage emperor with crimson lips drenched in Arabian perfume and commanding, "Call me Domina, your mistress." What makes the story even more shocking is the promise recorded by Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta. Elagabalus once declared he would reward half the empire to any physician who could turn him into a woman. In modern terms, it sounds eerily like a plea for gender transition, an aspiration far beyond the reach of ancient medicine. Perhaps Elagabalus saw in this wish a kind of liberation, a reconciliation of body and soul, something utterly incomprehensible to 3rd century Rome. Some modern scholars have even called Elagabalus the first clearly documented queer figure in history. Accounts of him wearing women's clothing, adorning himself with makeup, seeking lovers of both sexes, and yearning to be acknowledged as female have led many to see in him a gender identity that refused the binary. Yet scholars also warn, most of what we know about Elagabalus comes from hostile sources, especially senatorial historians, men who despised him for his foreignness and for polluting Rome. Where, then, between the lines of history, lies the truth, and where lies exaggeration? Perhaps we will never know for certain. Still, even when stripped of hostile embellishment, one thing remains clear. Elagabalus fundamentally challenged the Roman order. In a world where men ruled every sphere, from the battlefield to the Senate floor, he broke the boundaries, lived openly against the grain, and made himself the center of sexual ritual, of pleasure, and of gender inversion. If today we might look at Elagabalus with sympathy, as a soul trapped in an age unprepared for such diversity, for the Romans he was a nightmare. The senators whispered about him as theatra mulierum, a circus of women. The legions turned away from him. For what authority could a commander in a dress with powdered cheeks and a so-called husband at his side ever command? And when Elagabalus staged a wedding with a charioteer from Sirmia, a slave by birth, and declared him his royal consort, the insult reached its peak. Rome, the empire that had conquered the Mediterranean, now watched as its emperor placed a bridal wreath on the head of a man its citizens would not even have dignified as an equal. To the Roman mind, Elagabalus' sexuality was not private indulgence. It was humiliation. It was proof that Rome itself had been debased by a foreign boy. For in their eyes, the emperor was the living image of the state, and if that image was painted in rouge, clothed in silk, insisting on being hailed as a queen, then Rome itself was shamed before the world. But what if we ask the question differently? What if, beneath the hatred of ancient chroniclers, Elagabalus was in fact a figure ahead of his time? A person unwilling to bend to rigid definitions of gender, who dared to live authentically, even knowing that an empire glared at him with contempt. Perhaps that is why the story of Elagabalus is not only terrifying, not only grotesque, but also strangely poignant. A tale of a lonely soul adrift in the grandeur and coldness of Rome. And it was here that the end began. Extravagance, bizarre rituals, even orgiastic feasts, these Rome could stomach. But a direct assault on gender and religious order was unforgivable. His death, when it came, would come swiftly, violently, and with no shortage of disgrace. Yet before we turn to that grim finale, we must pause and reflect. Elagabalus, in all his absurdity and wildness, had become a symbol of the yearning to break free from chains. A yearning that ancient Rome could never and would never allow. Perhaps the cruelest irony of history is when a man who once sat upon the throne, believing the world revolved around him, slowly discovers that the throne itself is nothing more than a gilded trap. Elagabalus, the boy from Syria who was lifted to imperial power through the cunning of his grandmother Julia Maesa, entered a stage where everything around him began to crack. The Romans were no longer merely whispering about strange rituals and decadent pleasures. They were beginning to see in their young emperor a threat to the very survival of the empire. And so the shadow of betrayal began to creep in, from the army, from the Senate, and even from his own family. It is important to remember that the authority of a Roman emperor never rested solely on the throne, but upon three pillars: the loyalty of the army, the acceptance of the Senate, and the support of the Roman people. When Elagabalus first rose to power, the soldiers had cheered under Julia Maesa's banner, lured by promises of rewards and stability after the chaos of Caracalla and Macrinus. But as time passed, those promises ran dry, and Elagabalus drifted further and further from the image of a commander. He showed little interest in the battlefield, rarely donned armor, and instead wrapped himself in silks, parading in ceremonies to honor the sun god. To soldiers accustomed to mud and blood, such an image was an insult. Rumors spread that Rome did not have an emperor, but a queen sitting on the throne. The Senate was no kinder. Senators had once endured tyrants like Caligula and Domitian, so long as those emperors maintained the solemn mask of Roman authority. Elagabalus was different. He flaunted his actions openly. From carrying the sacred black stone of Elagabal to the Palatine Hill and placing it above Jupiter, to his bizarre and hurried marriages, every gesture seemed like a slap in the face of Roman pride. Each time he entered the Senate, the members did not see a dignified Augustus, but a painted youth, glittering eyes like some exotic priest from the East. Whispers spread that Rome was being transformed into a grotesque imitation of Emesa, and that if it continued, the empire itself might collapse. Yet Roman politics was never just about appearances. It was about blood and money. The army grew increasingly restless, and Elagabalus neither knew nor cared to secure their loyalty with campaigns or spoils. Instead of riding into battle for glory, he lingered in Rome, consumed with lavish entertainments. Instead of sharing wealth with his soldiers, he poured it into feasts, showered banquet guests with roses, and raised new temples. To veterans who had trudged through the wars of Parthia or the frozen frontiers, this was unmistakable proof their emperor was unworthy of their allegiance. In this atmosphere, Julia Mesa, the mastermind who had staged the entire drama to seat her grandson on the throne, sensed the danger. A seasoned player of power, she knew that if Elagabalus remained, not only would he be killed, but the entire Severan dynasty might be dragged down with him. And so, a new figure was introduced. Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, carefully positioned by Mesa and his mother Julia Mamaea as a counterweight. Unlike Elagabalus, Alexander appeared disciplined, measured, and most importantly, adept at winning the soldiers' respect. Comparisons spread quickly. Alexander was the future. Elagabalus merely a temporary nightmare. Elagabalus, of course, was not so foolish as to miss the shift. He heard the whispers in the palace, saw the looks in the courtiers' eyes, and understood that even his grandmother, the very woman who had placed the crown upon his head, was now plotting his replacement. Rage and paranoia consumed him. He tried to eliminate Alexander, but failed, for even his closest guards leaned quietly toward the calm young cousin. Step by step, Elagabalus was isolated within his own palace, a stranger among those who had once cheered for him. The final betrayal came from where he least expected, his own family. Julia Mesa, for the sake of survival, chose to sacrifice the grandson upon whom she had once gambled everything. When the army openly declared their support for Alexander, she did nothing to intervene. She knew Elagabalus's end was inevitable, and the only thing left was to ensure that his downfall did not drag the entire dynasty into ruin. The Senate, long disgusted with Elagabalus, quickly rallied behind Alexander, seizing the chance to reclaim a fragment of Rome's lost dignity. Ancient records tell us that Elagabalus begged desperately for protection, but even his Praetorian guards turned away. Once the army no longer stood behind him, the game of power was over. He was seized as he pleaded for mercy, dragged out of the palace, and his fate was sealed. His death, described in detail in the next chapter, was merely the final act of a process in which political ambition had failed, the army had scorned him, the Senate had despised him, and his family had abandoned him. The fall of Elagabalus's reign did not come through some cataclysmic war, nor through foreign armies marching into Rome. It came from the silent cracks within. This is the eternal story of power. A man may believe he can rule the world with rituals, revels, and illusions, but once he loses the loyalty of the army and the support of his kin, the throne is nothing more than an empty chair. Elagabalus had ascended as a strange phenomenon, and now he moved toward his end, a bitter lesson for all who dared to defy the order of Rome. The death of a young emperor is usually wrapped in tragedy, mournful laments, and final honors. But in the case of Elagabalus, everything unfolded in the exact opposite way. He rose to the throne through the schemes of his family, lived a scandal-soaked reign that lasted barely 4 years, and then fell in blood, hatred, and contempt. When spring of 222 dawned, the emperor was only 18. It was too little time to grow into a man, too short to correct his mistakes, yet just enough for him to carve his name into history as the most debauched ruler of Rome. The final days of Elagabalus were shrouded in tension at court. Generals in the Praetorian Guard had grown weary of his bizarre rituals, his indulgent feasts, and the political chaos he provoked. The army had once been the backbone of imperial power, but now the soldiers no longer saw their young ruler as one of them. He did not live like a Roman warrior, nor act as a true statesman. Instead, he devoted himself to lovers, to the sacrifices of the god Elagabal, and to the pursuit of pleasure. Julia Mesa, the grandmother who had placed him on the throne, slowly recognized the truth. She knew the dynasty was nearing its breaking point. To protect the Severan family, she could no longer shield Elagabalus. Quietly, she shifted her support to Alexander Severus, the calm, well-mannered cousin who had won the favor of the legions. With cunning foresight, Massa whispered to generals and officials that Alexander, not Elagabalus, was the hope of Rome's stability. Meanwhile, Elagabalus seemed blind to the tide rising beneath his feet. The climax came in March of 222. Sensing competition, Elagabalus tried to remove Alexander, but it was already too late. The Praetorian Guard, firmly on Alexander's side, rebelled. Uprising broke out inside Rome itself, and Elagabalus, along with his mother Julia Soamius, was hunted down in the palace. There was no valiant resistance, no loyal troops ready to die for their emperor. Everyone had turned their backs. Elagabalus was slain at only 18, closing one of the briefest and most notorious reigns in Roman history. Yet death was only the beginning of his humiliation. His body was dragged through the streets like that of a criminal rather than a supreme ruler. Crowds jeered, spat, cursed, and hurled stones and filth at him. At last, his corpse was flung into the Tiber, left for the waters to wash Rome clean. The treatment of his body revealed the depth of Rome's disdain. To them, Elagabalus was unworthy of a tomb, unworthy of burial rites, unworthy even to be remembered as part of the imperial lineage. The image of a dead emperor tossed into a filthy river like garbage testified to just how far he had shattered Roman norms. Soon after, Julia Mesa quickly secured Alexander Severus on the throne. With cold calculation, she saved the dynasty from destruction. Alexander, with his gentler temperament and broad military support, was welcomed as a savior. The Severan line endured, but the cost was the sacrifice of Elagabalus, the grandson she had once elevated with such ambition. In history's eyes, Elagabalus remains the embodiment of excess, of pleasures pushed beyond all limits, and of a Rome wearied and trembling in crisis. His death was less a passing than a ritual of purification, a city purging itself to reclaim order. And yet, despite the curses, Elagabalus lingers in the human imagination, a ghostly reminder that Rome was not only built by heroic emperors, but also scarred by those who tore down its boundaries and left behind a haunting legacy. Elagabalus is gone, but his story never vanished. It echoes across the centuries, a warning about the fragility of power and the price of straying too far from society's limits. Perhaps, in his very strangeness, Elagabalus achieved another kind of immortality, not through glory, but through infamy. Elagabalus died at just 18 years old. A short life, yet one that left behind one of the most controversial figures in all of Roman history. His name became synonymous with decadence, with desires that defied every boundary, with a reign that burst like a storm and was consumed within its own chaos. And yet, the irony is this. He is remembered not for policy or victories, but for tales of excess, for lurid anecdotes whose truth remains uncertain. Forever blurred between fact and the dark imagination of Roman historians who despised him. Ancient writers, most notably Cassius Dio and Herodian, spared no venom when sketching the portrait of this bizarre emperor. Dio, with undisguised contempt, describes banquets where Elagabalus showered guests with so many rose petals they nearly suffocated, or bizarre sacrificial rites that rattled Rome's cultural foundations. Herodian paints him as an exotic outsider, that forcing Eastern gods upon the imperial capital, a child who never grasped the delicate balance between power, tradition, and belief. To them, Elagabalus was not an emperor at all, but a stain, a disgrace. Then comes the Historia Augusta, notorious for rumor and invention, where his image grows even more grotesque. There, he appears as a sexual deviant, a creature so depraved he supposedly submitted to his own servants or begged physicians to transform him into a woman. Such stories, impossible to verify, have nevertheless endured for centuries because they perfectly fit the narrative of the mad emperor that posterity wanted to impose on his brief reign. But history is never simple. Some modern scholars suggest that beneath the accusations of lust and perversion may lie little more than propaganda, an effort to justify the assassination of a sitting emperor. To kill a ruler requires a reason, and no excuse works better than painting him as a moral monstrosity, a danger to the survival of Rome itself. In a society where honor, morality, and religion were weapons of politics, twisting Elagabalus's image may have been the most efficient way to make his removal palatable. Today, another dimension of his legacy has drawn attention: questions of gender and identity. Many now reread the scattered ancient accounts with new eyes, wondering if Elagabalus might have been one of the first queer or transgender figures recorded in Western history. His wearing of women's clothes, his makeup, his request to be called empress instead of emperor, even his promise of a fortune to anyone who could make him a woman. These are no longer dismissed as grotesque jokes. They may represent a fragile but genuine voice, an identity desperately out of place in a world that had no room for such difference. Of course, we cannot project modern categories of gender onto antiquity, but the survival of these fragments has made Elagabalus an enduring figure in the history of queer studies. Still, no matter the lens, Elagabalus remains a ruler out of step with his times. He had no grasp of politics, no ability to command the army, no respect for Rome's sacred traditions. At a moment when the empire needed strength and stability, he turned the throne into a private stage for his pleasures and his foreign faith. That was an alienation no class, the Senate, the military, or the people could forgive. And yet, paradoxically, Elagabalus left behind another legacy: his image as a cultural icon in European art and literature centuries later. Renaissance and Baroque painters returned again and again to the image of his rose-petal feasts as emblems of depravity. 19th century writers, intoxicated by the strange and the decadent, embraced him as a symbol of beauty corrupted, of pleasure taken to its limits. Oscar Wilde, Antonin Artaud, and the poets of the decadent movement all found in Elagabalus a kind of allure, a figure who embodied forbidden desire and rebellion against restraint. For others, Elagabalus served as a cautionary mirror. To Romans and their heirs, he became a story crafted to prove the necessity of order. This is what happens when an empire falls into the hands of a deranged child. He was the ultimate lesson that absolute power cannot be entrusted to one who scorns tradition and discipline. His brutal, humiliating death was the final punctuation of that warning. But history, like a fractured mirror, never reflects only one face. To some, Elagabalus was the pervert emperor, unworthy of remembrance. To others, he stands as a symbol of rebellion against rigid norms. And to modern scholars, he is also a case study in how power, gender, and propaganda intertwine to shape the memory of a person. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: it is precisely the things most hated about Elagabalus that ensured his immortality. Had he been forgettable, had he lived a few more years and died quietly, his name might have vanished like dozens of other Roman rulers. But because he was different, or because others made him appear so, Elagabalus still lives, in paintings, in books, in the endless debates over history, sexuality, and identity. And maybe that is his truest legacy. Not a stable reign, not victories on the battlefield, but the reminder that in every civilization there are those who step outside the lines. Their fates, whether cursed or celebrated, always make history richer, stranger, and more alive.